For many years, Final Fantasy III existed only as a rumor in the minds of Western fans. But in Japan, the game was a hugely influential title that helped establish Final Fantasy's unique identity and introduced many of its most famous ideas. In this retrospective, I'll show you what the original version of the game was like and explain why this is Final Fantasy's last true role-playing game. Just to be clear, this is the game that was called Final Fantasy III in Japan, not the American version of Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy III has had several remakes over the years, but this retrospective is about the original Famicom version from 1990. And since this game never got an official English translation, I'll be playing the 1999 fan translation by Neil Corlett and Alex W. Jackson. But where the names of characters, places, and game terms differ from later official translations, I'll try to stick with the official ones. Final Fantasy III was released in Japan on April 27, 1990, about a year and a half from the release of Final Fantasy II. And in many ways, the game can be seen as a direct reaction to its predecessor. As I explained in my retrospective of Final Fantasy II, the second game's activity-based progression system was ambitious but deeply flawed. Instead, Final Fantasy III would be a return to the tried and true structure of the original game, but with a big twist. On the surface, Final Fantasy III looks a lot like the two previous titles, but this game pushed the aging hardware of the NES to its limits. The heroes got a slight but noticeable facelift. The battle arenas have a bit more detail, and towns and dungeons show more depth and variation. But the biggest improvements came in the form of the game's monsters. Enemies are large, elaborate, and colorful. Some changes are subtle, like the King Behemoth, while others are striking, like the Red Dragon. Another graphical achievement was in the first appearance of one of Final Fantasy's most famous special abilities. Odin was the first summoned monster to be designed for the game, and his iconic Zan Tetsuken attack slices enemies in half. Literally. But as big a step forward as the graphics were, it's nothing compared to the giant leap made in another area. The quality of the music. The overworld theme, Eternal Wind, is both melancholic and hopeful, and beautifully captures the game's spirit of adventure. The final dungeon's world of darkness is epic and foreboding, and the area Maiden of Water is often named as the first piece of music written as a character theme in the Final Fantasy series, although Matoya might have something to say about that. Final Fantasy III's soundtrack still lacks the touch of mastery of the SNES games, but shows the first sparks of the genius of composer Nobuo Uematsu. But technical improvements were only the beginning. Final Fantasy III's biggest strides were made in a much more fundamental part of the game. The basic gameplay remains the same as in the first two Final Fantasies. The player controls a party of 4 characters on an epic quest to save the world. The heroes explore a large overworld map filled with forests, rivers, and mountains. The party begins their journey on foot, but later gets access to a bunch of different vehicles, including several different airships. Traveling around the world will trigger random encounters with monsters that reward you with experience points and gold. Towns and castles provide the heroes with a place to rest, gather information, and buy spells and equipment. Caves, ruins, and other dungeons must be explored and powerful boss monsters defeated to advance the story. For the first time, party management has been consolidated into a single menu with everything you need. The interface is a lot more user-friendly, and repetitive tasks like healing party members can be done a lot faster. These improvements are welcome, but what really sets Final Fantasy III apart from the first two games is its most famous feature. And ironically, this is something most people would like to see deleted from real life. Jobs. Just like in the original game, characters in Final Fantasy III have jobs that determine their attributes and abilities. But this time, the characters' jobs are not set in stone at the start of the game. Instead, the heroes can switch jobs at any time through the party menu. The heroes begin the game as Onion Knights, a starter job with no special abilities, but can change into one of 5 more specialized jobs after finding the Wind Crystal. You get 4 more jobs after restoring the Fire Crystal, 7 new jobs from the water crystal, and 3 additional jobs when you reach the earth crystal. Finally, there's 2 secret jobs to find by completing an optional dungeon at the end of the game. That makes a total of 22 jobs, and each one has its own unique strengths and weaknesses. The Knight is a powerful frontline fighter with high defense and can shield near-death allies from blows. The Thief is a fast, knife-wielding specialist who can steal items from monsters and open locked doors. And the White Mage is loaded with healing magic and protective enchantments. Each job fills a different role, or at least that's how it should be. In reality, that's not what happens, for one simple reason. Job balance is pretty darn broken. While all jobs have their uses, some are definitely better than others. Many of the jobs you unlock later in the game are direct upgrades to earlier jobs. The Knight is stronger, tougher, and faster than the Warrior, and can equip better weapons. The Black Belt is an upgraded Monk, and the Devout is a White Mage with stronger magic, more spell points, and better stats. This design philosophy reaches absurd levels when you unlock the game's final 2 jobs, the Sage and the Ninja. These 2 are so much better than anything else in the game, it's kind of hilarious. The Sage is the ultimate spellcaster, with access to all white and black magic as well as every summoning spell. And the Ninja has superior physical attributes and can equip any weapon or armor. Once you get your hands on these 2, there's really no reason to ever use another job. It is a fitting reward for clearing a difficult optional dungeon, but it pretty much takes all of the fun out of the endgame. Many jobs do have unique abilities that can't be replaced by other jobs, but frankly, most of them just aren't that great. The Thief looks good on paper, but stealing is hopelessly unreliable, and the monsters don't have anything good. The Ranger can attack from the back row with bows, but can't compete with frontline fighters for damage, and their healing magic is weak. And the Geomancer's terrain ability can be used endlessly without the need for MP, but it's inflexible, unreliable, and will backfire if you miss your targets. Other jobs are weak because of the fundamental nature of the job system. When you can change jobs at will, there really isn't much point in having generalist jobs. The Bard can attack from the back row with harps, cheer its allies to boost their attack, and scare enemies into running away. But none of the Bard's mediocre abilities really make up for losing out on a more specialized job, such as a fighter or a spellcaster. The same can be said for one of Final Fantasy's most iconic jobs. The Red Mage balances white and black magic while also being able to wield powerful swords and wear decent armor. This versatility was great in the original Final Fantasy, where the team you picked at the start would have to carry you through the entire game. But in Final Fantasy III, versatility is the whole point of the system. When you can change a character's job at any time, the Red Mage's ability to adapt to any situation becomes almost redundant. Still, you can make any job work if you want to. The job system offers a lot of freedom in customizing your party, and Final Fantasy III is at its most fun when you're making full use of this feature to adjust your team to deal with the game's different dungeons and bosses. Sadly, a lot of this fun is sucked out of the game by what I consider to be Final Fantasy III's most unfortunate design flaw. The solutions to most of the game's challenges are way too obvious. With so many combinations of jobs to choose from, Final Fantasy III offers up a realm of possibility in selecting your preferred playstyle. You can try to build a balanced party that can handle any situation, pound your enemies into submission with nothing but swords and axes, or pull your whole crew into the back row and pummel the monsters with endless spells. You could even suit up as 4 thieves and escape from every single battle just to power through a dungeon you hate. But more than likely, you'll switch your team around in one of 3 situations. When you receive new jobs, when you pick up some really nice piece of equipment, or when you face a dungeon or boss your current party just can't beat. In its best moments, the game really nails this experience. The boss of the Molten Cave dungeon is the Salamander, which spends most of its turns spamming a fire attack that hits the whole party. It's one of the game's earliest potential roadblocks, where you're likely to run into trouble if you haven't been paying attention. Fortunately, you have plenty of options. You can add more white mages and try to heal through the damage. You can pick up more ice armor and go heavy on warriors. Or you can add 1 or more black mages and spam high-level ice spells. All the tools and information you need are at your disposal, and you're left to figure it out on your own. It's really fun. Unfortunately, the game can also be extremely heavy-handed and prescriptive in how it structures its challenges. Final Fantasy III is designed to encourage the player to make full use of the job system, but the way it goes about it is about as subtle as being hit over the head with a frying pan. Many of the game's dungeons and bosses are designed with a very specific solution in mind, and it's painfully obvious what the game wants you to do. The wizard Hein is a pushover if you've got a scholar in your party, but unless you refuse to talk to NPCs altogether, you'll know this long before you even show up at his castle. The Cave of Shadows is hell without at least one Dark Knight on the team, but even if you somehow miss this information, you'll be reminded the moment you step inside the dungeon. But the most absurd example of this design philosophy comes when the party is stranded in the kingdom of Salonia. Salonia's boss encounter is Garuda, a bird demon that batters all 4 heroes with wind magic. Garuda hits like a truck, and unless you want to spend a couple of hours grinding levels around Salonia, you'll need another solution. That solution happens to be Dragoons, 4 of them. Dragoons do bonus damage to flying creatures, and their jump ability lets them avoid many of Garuda's attacks. It's honestly a pretty cool solution, except that the game won't shut up about it. From the moment you first set foot in Salonia, you're showered in clues about how to prepare for the upcoming boss. You start picking up Dragoon equipment as you explore the city's districts. The only shop that's still open sells spears, a weapon which is exclusive to Dragoons. And one of the districts even has the Dragon's Tower, an optional dungeon that rewards you with multiple sets of Dragoon armor. Oh, and yeah, people tell you Garuda can only be defeated by Dragoons. It all pretty much adds up to the game shouting, "Hey stupid, switch to 4 Dragoons right now." To be fair, it's not like the game forces you to follow these suggestions, and you're certainly welcome to come up with a solution of your own. But the problem is that in almost every situation in the game, the right answer is so obvious, it kinda takes the fun out of the experience. Good game design nudges the player towards a certain behavior by making a feature more fun, effective, or rewarding in certain situations. When it's done right, the game will guide you towards the right answer without you even realizing it wasn't your own idea. Basically, figuring things out on your own is fun, and following instructions is boring. Final Fantasy III should be all about switching jobs and adjusting your team on the fly. But even if you wanted to make the most out of the game's freewheeling job system, you're facing another problem. And this is an incredibly basic feature of the game's design: how you switch jobs. To change from one job to another, you need capacity points. CP is a shared party resource you get from defeating monsters, and it acts as a soft limit on how often your characters can switch jobs. The idea is for you to collect it where you can, then spend it where it counts, to make the adjustments you need to carry you through the game. But honestly, capacity points don't really matter. You just don't need to change jobs that often, and chances are you'll spend most of the game capped at the maximum of 255 capacity points. Instead, the biggest restriction you'll face isn't even a feature of the job system. It's something much simpler: your equipment. Different jobs use different weapons and armor. Vikings can only wield axes, Dragoons can only use spears, and Knights are limited to swords. Because there's so little overlap, the relative strengths of different jobs at different points in the game depends a lot on the access to appropriate weapons and armor. The placement of treasure has a huge influence on player decisions, and finding a new weapon can often be as exciting as getting a new job. Early in the game, you can swing by Castle Sassoon's western tower to pick up a sword called the White Slayer. This weapon is super effective against the undead, but it can only be wielded by a red mage, giving you a reason to try the job out. And after picking up the water crystal, the Viking outperforms the Knight, but only until you find the Defender's Sword, when the Knight suddenly becomes the strongest melee fighter in the game again. It's got a real old school Dungeons & Dragons feel to it, using whatever weapons and armor the Dungeon Master happened to roll for on some random table, and I love that. But Final Fantasy III takes this a bit too far sometimes. When you get the water crystal, you unlock 7 new jobs. But Dragoons need spears, which won't be available until you reach Salonia. Geomancers and bards need bells and harps, both of which can be found in the village of Duster. Evokers need summoning spells, and those are only sold in Repleto. And Dark Knights need Dark Swords, which are unique to the people of Falgabard. In fact, the people of Falgabard are so devoted to their craft, even the freaking innkeeper is a Dark Knight. Imagine checking into a hotel and the guy at the front desk looks like this. Hang in there, buddy. You'll make it big someday. But even if you had access to all the gear you'd ever need, you're facing an even bigger problem, and this is probably the single most frustrating part of the whole game. The inventory. Keeping your options open means carrying a lot of different weapons and armor. That'd be fine if the game's inventory wasn't so limited. There's room for a total of 32 items in your inventory, and that includes key items you need for the story. A full set of equipment for a single job usually takes up about 4 or 5 slots. And then there's healing items, antidotes, spellcasting items, and any extra spells you got lying around. But it gets worse. To switch jobs, you have to first unequip the character. This is clunky and annoying on its own, but the real problem is, again, the inventory. You need 5 free slots to even unequip a character, and that's a big ask in the middle of a dungeon, especially after picking up a bunch of treasure along the way. Inventory troubles are somewhat helped by the existence of an adorable new friend, the Fat Chocobo. This overgrown burb can be summoned at Chocobo forests and other spots in the game by using Gazelle Greens. The Fat Chocobo allows you to store and retrieve items, kinda like a stash you can access from any of the world's Fat Chocobos. This helps, but it still doesn't solve the main problem. Most inventory issues come up in the middle of dungeons, and you can't summon the Fat Chocobo at the bottom of a cave. There's also no way to restore magic points in the middle of a dungeon besides burning an elixir, so you can forget about tagging in a spellcaster right before the boss. Final Fantasy III's job system allows for an enormous degree of freedom. With 4 characters and 22 different jobs, the number of possible combinations you can try is something like 12,000. I'm not gonna do math in public, but feel free to let me know the exact number in the comments below. With that many options to choose from, every player's experience with Final Fantasy III should be different. In reality, because of how the game is designed, most players will end up with a very similar experience. This first version of the job system was far from perfect. Job balance is a mess, the game's other systems sometimes clash with it, and the game is way too preachy about how you should be using the jobs. There's also no abilities to unlock or milestones to look forward to. Improving your job level makes you more powerful in combat, but that's pretty much it. Even so, the job system is a lot of fun, and it was a massive innovation at the time. It's gone on to become one of the most famous and popular recurring features of the Final Fantasy series, and a cornerstone of games like Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Final Fantasy XIV. JRPGs can be very linear experiences, but the best of them give you that magical sense of freedom when you open up the menu and see a world of possibility unfold before you. The game becomes less about the what and more about the how. And for all the failings of the job system, Final Fantasy III has that. It's a brilliant system, and it adds a ton of depth to Final Fantasy III's gameplay, especially in the most central part of the experience: combat. Final Fantasy III's battle system puts a ton of options in the player's hands. There's just a lot more stuff to do now, both in and out of combat. Party configuration is obviously a lot more involved, but you've also got some tough choices to make when it comes to equipment, since dual wielding actually works as intended this time. Do you go with 2 weapons for double damage, or a shield to increase survivability? The party formation system got a bit of an overhaul too. The original game had its marching order, and the sequel introduced the front and back row. But Final Fantasy III is the first time we see the fully fledged party formation system we've come to expect from the classic Final Fantasy games. Characters in the back row basically do half damage with close-range weapons, but also take half damage from such attacks. Spellcasters fit naturally into the back row, but even fighter types can do well there if you give them a bow or a boomerang. There's also a lot more stuff to do in combat. Finally, for the first time in the series, there's the defend command. Not all jobs get it, and it doesn't really do much good, but having the option to skip your turn now and then is a very welcome addition. Every job now has something unique to do, like the Thief's Steal command and the Scholar's Study ability, which gives you information about the target. But this wasn't the only way the game added options to combat. You can switch out your equipped weapon for anything in your inventory in the middle of battle. You can use items from the inventory instead of just what you have equipped. And you can even target a specific group of enemies with spells. Characters also have 2 more commands to use in combat that aren't immediately obvious: retreat and advance. Characters can spend their turn to advance to the front row or retreat to the back row of the party formation. This adds some flexibility in the middle of a fight, but it's also a cursed feature. Stick around for the end of the video and I'll explain why this is the single most annoying thing in the whole game. Combat runs a lot faster than before. Attack animations are quick. Damage numbers now bounce above the target instead of showing up in text boxes. And casting spells on multiple enemies, which could be a nightmare in the previous 2 games, now resolves lightning fast. Another change to the game's magic wasn't a new idea, but instead a return to something they'd tried before. Only this time, they got it right. Final Fantasy II was the first game in the series to use the now familiar system where characters pay for spells using a pool of magic points. Instead of building on this feature, Final Fantasy III went back to the system used in the original game, which was taken from Dungeons & Dragons. Once again, spells are divided into levels according to their power, and spellcasters can cast a certain number of spells of each spell level. The original game was too faithful to Dungeons & Dragons, and its magic system could feel stifling and restrictive with how stingy it was with magic points. Final Fantasy III adapts the system to the special conditions of a video game built around an insane number of random encounters. Basically, you can cast a lot more spells. The result is a magic system that feels much more in tune with the game, and is surprisingly fun. You still have to make meaningful decisions about which spells to cast and when, but you no longer feel like you have to save every single spell slot for an emergency. For all these improvements, combat still suffers from one major problem. There just isn't much to it, tactically. It's not that the monsters lack variety. Some have extra powerful attacks, while others can take a beating but don't do a lot of damage. And some inflict dangerous status effects like confusion and should be nuked from orbit the moment they show up. The problem is that while you have a lot of tools in your toolbox, most encounters can be solved without them. 9 out of 10 fights come down to simply having all of your characters attack, and maybe casting a spell here and there. Most boss fights keep to this same pattern, and it's really just a race to see who runs out of hit points first. Even the game's final boss is no different. Beating Cloud of Darkness means surviving a constant barrage of Flare Wave, a super powerful attack that inflicts thousands of damage with every hit. There is no finesse to conquering this fight, just brute force. But there are some rare exceptions, and it's in those few instances where you actually have to think that the game is at its best. The battle against the wizard Hein asks the player to work around the boss's barrier shift ability, which randomly changes his elemental weak spot every few rounds. Bomb type enemies will self-destruct for massive damage, but only if they've been hit, so you want to focus them down one by one. And dividing enemies will split into 2 every time they're hit with weapons, so you'll need to track how much damage each one's taken. And ironically, these last 2 situations actually become harder because of one pretty significant change that Final Fantasy III made to combat: auto-targeting. For the first time in Final Fantasy, characters that target monsters that die before the character makes their attack will automatically target one of the remaining monsters instead. Being able to mindlessly spam attacks to power through encounters really adds a lot to the casual enjoyment of the game, but it does also reduce the tactical complexity. Without auto-targeting, you had to make constant tactical calculations in combat. Do you focus your attacks on a single monster even though it might die to one more hit, or do you spread your damage out among several targets? but adding auto-targeting doesn't actually make Final Fantasy III easier. Bombs and dividing enemies are just two examples of situations where being able to concentrate your whole party's attacks on a single monster without having to worry about collateral damage would have made the game a lot easier. Be careful what you wish for, I guess? One really cool thing the Final Fantasies on the NES did that later games abandoned is in how attacks are presented. As characters level up and get more powerful, they get more potential hits with each attack, all of which are actually animated. And I've gotta say that hitting an enemy 12 times with a sword is pretty darn satisfying. I honestly wish they still did this. But we cannot talk about combat without talking about the places where you'll be doing most of the fighting. The dungeons. Final Fantasy III's dungeons are mostly short and sweet. Branching paths are used more sparingly. And although the dungeons still allow for a bit of exploration, there's a lot less chance of getting lost. And honestly, the dungeons are just more fun this time around. The Tower of Owen has a unique steampunk look, full of gears and cogwheels. Heinz Castle is set inside a living tree with matted roots covering every surface. And the Temple of Time is a foreboding undersea shrine filled with waterlogged passages. At the same time, some of the game's biggest flaws are found in its dungeon designs, and the worst of these mistakes are related to the game's most annoying spell. Mini shrinks the target down to the size of a garden gnome, but being tiny is no picnic. A character suffering from Mini won't do any damage with weapons. They can still use magic, but they're extremely vulnerable to both physical and magical attacks. Mini is easy enough to cure, but several of the game's dungeons, such as the Nepto Shrine and the Cave of the Circle, are built around the use of this spell. You cannot enter these places without casting Mini on your whole party, and you've gotta stay that way throughout the dungeon. The monsters you face inside do tons of damage to you, and your only options are to rely on magic or to run away from battle. But running is terrible in Final Fantasy III. It's unreliable, leaves your characters defenseless, and not all jobs even have the run command. Miniature dungeons was a clever idea, but the way they're implemented kinda sucks. Many of the game's dungeons have hidden passages that offer shortcuts or treasure. Thankfully, the level design does a pretty good job of telegraphing these, but there is one exception. The Cave of Shadows is one of the game's final dungeons, and it's absolutely packed with secret passages. While many of these are dead ends or hold optional treasure, some actually hide the way forward. With tons of levels and sub-levels and a Swiss cheese of hidden paths, the Cave of Shadows can be fiendishly disorienting without the map. But the Cave of Shadows is child's play when compared to the game's final brutal super dungeon, the Crystal Tower. The final dungeon is actually separated into 3 parts: the Ancient's Labyrinth, Circus Tower, and the World of Darkness. You get to save your game between the Ancient's Labyrinth and Circus Tower, but the last 2 parts must be beaten back to back. The World of Darkness forces you to beat 4 highly deadly bosses in a row, and if you make it through that, you've still got the final boss to confront. It's a truly brutal gauntlet, and a single mistake will send you back to the world map, forcing you to do Circus Tower all over again. The final dungeon is especially unforgiving, but it's really just a natural extension of the game's design philosophy. This is a test of endurance. Monsters hit hard, there are no save points in dungeons, and Phoenix Down is as rare as diamonds. Dungeons aren't so much about exploration as they are about survival. It's a test of patience and forward thinking, where the real challenge is to balance limited resources against countless random encounters and somehow make it through the dungeon before you run out of spells, items, and hit points. Honestly, sometimes playing Final Fantasy III feels like being an accountant trying to keep a dying company from going bankrupt. But as frustrating as this design can be, it can also be tremendously satisfying. What old school RPGs like Final Fantasy III have going for them is the feeling of tension and release. As you go deeper and deeper into that hostile dungeon, the tension mounts with each step you take. You gain levels, fill your inventory with treasure, and get closer closer to your goal. But each step also brings you closer to disaster. Hit points are lost, healing magic runs low, and sooner or later you've used your last Phoenix down. Will you make it out alive, limping back to town to rest up and literally save your progress? Or will you fall on the finish line, losing everything you've worked so hard for over the last hour? There's real, honest tension there, and that's a feeling most modern games just can't give you. That said, Final Fantasy III can be pretty grindy. I finished the game in about 30 hours, and 10 of those were spent straight up grinding for levels. I don't know, maybe I just suck. This is a game that rewards exploration. Towns and dungeons are filled with secret passages, and treasure hides everywhere, from the tall grass surrounding houses to caves behind waterfalls. Some towns even have optional mini-dungeons, like the Western Tower in Castle Sassoon or the Mithril Mines in the town of Kasus. There's also more stuff to see. There's a grand library in Salonia that adds backstory about the creation of airships and the origins of the floating continent. There's dancers that will perform for you and bars with pianos to play, and one of them even triggers a dance scene that's straight out of Bollywood. There are entire secret dungeons to find, hidden villages to hunt down, and some truly epic bosses to challenge. The village of Gisal sells magic keys and Gisal greens, but you won't even know it's there unless you go looking for it. The sunken cave provides an entire treasure-filled dungeon hidden at the bottom of the ocean, and Odin awaits the heroes in Salonia's sealed catacombs. With so many secrets and optional locations, there's a feeling that there's always something more to be found. A feeling that if you don't look hard enough, you're gonna miss something amazing. And for the first time in the Final Fantasy series, you actually might. Information is hard to avoid these days, but back then, without the internet to guide you and only rumors from friends to keep you informed, exploring Final Fantasy III's vast world and searching for its countless secrets must have been an unforgettable experience. The high point is the moment when Final Fantasy III's greatest secret is revealed. After the Warriors of Light get the second airship, they fly it literally off the edge of the world, leaving everything they've known behind to follow the call to adventure. As they pass through the clouds, the sun emerges, revealing a boundless ocean stretching in every direction. An entire world drowned beneath the waves. Vast and empty, it feels infinite. It's pure magic. For all the simplicity of the NES presentation, this is still a breathtaking moment, and it must have been incredible at the time. Usually, story is one of the first things I talk about in my videos. This time, I've saved it for last. Not because it's less important, but because this game is actually all about storytelling, just not in the way you might think. With Final Fantasy II, Square tried to tell a more ambitious story with a stronger cast of characters. The sequel went back to basics. Final Fantasy III once again tells the story of the 4 Warriors of Light. But this is not the same group of heroes who killed chaos in the original Final Fantasy. Instead, Final Fantasy III is set in its own world, but borrows many themes and ideas from the original game. Among those ideas are the elemental crystals of light, whose primeval power protects the world from disaster. The story begins when an earthquake ravages the land, disturbing the crystal's precious balance. 4 adventurous young orphans stumble into a cave opened up by the tremors. There they find the Wind Crystal, which grants them power as its chosen champions, and tasks them with finding the remaining crystals to restore balance to the world and save it from a flood of darkness. In search of the crystals, the Warriors of Light explore many lands and places, learn shocking secrets about the origin of their world, and eventually confront the mastermind of the world's misery, the evil sorcerer Sande. But just like the original Final Fantasy, the game has a twist villain. When the heroes confront Sunday at the top of the Crystal Tower, they learn that he has been nothing but a pawn under the control of the story's true antagonist, the Cloud of Darkness. The Cloud of Darkness isn't winning any awards for most developed character. After all, she is literally a personification of chaos who hungers for the destruction of the world. But she does have her qualities. She's savage, stylish, and deliciously cool. And she's also Final Fantasy's first female villain. Final Fantasy III's story is epic, but the way it's told is primitive, even by the standards of its time. Cutscenes are basic, and dialogue is extremely sparse. When Cid's airship is destroyed while clearing the path to the town of Canaan, there's no reaction from Cid, not even a single word. And when the heroes wake up in the town of Amur after raising the drowned world from the bottom of the sea, there's no cutscene to explain what's happened while you were passed out. Instead, you're sent out into town to learn 4 important facts. That a man named Goldor has chained your ship to the harbor, that Goldor lives in a mansion far to the south, that you'll need a pair of floating shoes to pass the bottomless swamp that guards his mansion, and that the floating shoes are owned by the witch Delilah, who lives in the sewers beneath Amur. But since the game has no safeguard to make sure you actually get any of this information, you're just as likely to end up in the sewers before you even learn what the floating shoes are, why you need them, or even what's happened to your ship. It's pretty wild. The story lacks pacing. There's a couple of cool plot twists here and there, but there's no real hook to pull you into the story. You spend half the game not even knowing the threat you're up against, and until you confront Sandy at the top of the Crystal Tower, the only contact you have with the villain is through his minions. Many of the game's plot points are also confusing or even outright contradictory, and I can't tell if it's because of actual plot holes or if the game just does a crap job of telling its story. But every now and then, the game shows a glimmer of the series' bright future, and there is one area in which Final Fantasy III clearly outshines its predecessors: the scenarios. The second game introduced Final Fantasy's first scenarios, like having your ship swallowed by Leviathan or fighting in the Colosseum. But Final Fantasy III takes things a step further. The sorcerer Hein captures the heroes and imprisons them in his flying castle. After the heroes raise the drowned world from beneath the oceans, their ship is chained to the harbor by the evil Goldor. And when the heroes fly their airship over the kingdom of Salonia, they're shot down, trapping them in the massive walled city until they can resolve the troubles that plague Salonia. These individual scenarios were impressive for their time, but when taken as a whole, they suffer from one significant flaw. They can be pretty random. The heroes visit Dragon's Peak just because they heard some guy went missing there. At the Dwarven Hollow, the heroes help the dwarves retrieve the stolen ice horn before they even know they'll need it to enter the Molten Cave. And when the sorcerer Hein threatens the people of Tokkul, the heroes rush to the town's defense. This is a story of 4 heroes who go from town to town and do nice things for people they don't know. And things just sort of work out for them because of it. After breaking the curse on the people of Kazuz, the townsmith happens to know how to clear the path to Canaan. After being rescued from Bahamut's nest, Dash gives the heroes the mini-spell, which they need to continue their journey. And in Salonia, ending the civil war rewards the heroes with a new airship, capable of reaching Doga's Manor. Perhaps the game's real message is that the Warriors of Light are, well, heroes. This is a story about kindness, where no good deed goes unrewarded. Even the game's conclusion supports this idea. When Sunday traps the heroes with the curse of the 5 worms and all seems lost, it's the people the heroes have helped throughout the story who come to their rescue. So perhaps the central theme of Final Fantasy III is just that. Kindness saves the world. Final Fantasy III is in many ways a big step back from the previous game. But a story is more than the sum of its scenarios, cutscenes, and themes. And we still need to talk about the most important part: the characters. Before I get to the last part, I just want to say, if you enjoyed this video, I'd be super grateful if you could hit the like button and leave a quick comment, as it really helps the video reach more people. I love making this kind of video, but they do take a lot of time and effort to produce. So if you want to support me, I'd be immensely grateful if you would consider subscribing to my channel. Final Fantasy III often feels like a tribute to the original Final Fantasy. Both games feature nameless warriors of light, the 4 elemental crystals, and an ancient prophecy. But Final Fantasy III also brought a lot of new stuff to the table. This game introduced so many of the things that have come to define Final Fantasy. The fully fledged job system, with classic jobs like Dragoon, Dark Knight, and Summoner. Special abilities like Steal and Jump. Summoned monsters, including Shiva, Ifrit, and Odin. And it's also the origin of the Crystal Tower, the Sword Ragnarok, the Fat Chocobo, and Moogles. But Final Fantasy III should also be celebrated as the last of its kind, because this is Final Fantasy's last true role-playing game. To convey a character's personality, modern games rely more and more on cinematic tools such as dialogue, body language, and action. Because of their technical limitations, old games had to depend on more elementary things, like who the character is, and especially what they do. Even without a single word spoken, a character's role and position within the story helps build an idea of who that character is in the player's mind. In the original Final Fantasy, the fact that one of the heroes is a warrior and the other a black mage creates a fundamental difference in how the two are perceived. After all, someone who devotes their life to the study of black magic must be a different person than the one who mastered hand-to-hand combat. Even if the game does nothing to expand on the character's nature, the player's imagination will fill in the rest. Final Fantasy II dropped the fixed roles from the original game. Instead, it added a bit of narrative definition to the characters, giving them basic personalities and backgrounds, while still allowing the player to shape the character's path through the world in an organic way. Final Fantasy III did neither of these things. Because the job system lets them change roles as easily as a person changes clothes, the heroes are reduced to faceless avatars with only a single thing to identify them: a name. But the Warriors of Light are not just anonymous heroes. They're blank slates for the player to invest with character and meaning. The later games in the series tell custom-made stories about predefined characters, but Final Fantasy III has no Cecil Harvey or Cloud Strife. Instead, it gives you avatars of infinite potential, through which you write your own story. Just like in the tabletop role-playing games that inspired Final Fantasy in the first place, these are your characters to define. Their stories are written by the adventures they have, the choices you make, and the luck of the dice. And the rest, well, that's all in your mind. Final Fantasy III asks the player to read between the lines, fill in the blanks, and find their own meaning. As a child, I built worlds from my Lego blocks, and told stories about the people who lived there. Final Fantasy III is powered just as much by that childlike imagination as it is by the NES hardware, and that's an incredibly powerful force. As video games have matured and I've grown older, games like Final Fantasy III have come to look a lot less appealing, primitive, outdated, boring. But maybe that's on me. Maybe it's not the game that's missing something. Maybe I'm the one who lost something. I spent the whole game thinking these 4 characters had made no impression on me whatsoever. But that's not exactly true. Even now, they come alive in my mind. Tyblis is the protector. He is patient and strong, and would rather die than let his friends come to harm. Jaime is the fighter. He's single-minded, brash, and cannot stand for injustice. Olku is the jack of all trades. His talents run wide, but he's too restless to ever commit himself to any one path. And Makoto is the healer. He dedicated himself early on to keeping his friends alive, and grew to become a powerful archmage worthy of Doga's teachings. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but isn't that the point? After all, this is a role-playing game. I mentioned earlier that having the ability to switch roles in combat is a cursed feature. Let me explain. It's been my experience that every JRPG has that one game mechanic that sucks more than anything else. For me, in Final Fantasy, it was getting poisoned. And in Final Fantasy II, it was trying to level MP. Well, in Final Fantasy III, getting poisoned was a real pleasure, and grinding magic points was the least of my concerns. This time around, the absolute worst thing the game inflicts on the player is a feature that didn't exist before. This was something that was introduced to add complexity to combat and force the player to think on their feet. Back attacks. Every random encounter has a chance of being a back attack, where the party's front and back rows are reversed, exposing your weakest characters to a sneak attack from the monsters. But surviving that first surprise round is only the beginning. Not only do you have to sit there and get hammered by the monsters before you can even act, but then you have to waste a whole round switching your character's rows before you can even launch a counterattack. And again, running absolutely sucks in this game. Even worse, the changes you made to your party formation stick after battle, meaning you'll have to open up the menu and fix your formation after every single back attack. And it's really easy to forget to do that, so you might start your next battle in the wrong formation. It's more than bad. It's worse than poison. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.